thank you for being here. I hope you've enjoyed the symposium thus far. I hope you enjoyed the keynote speech and your lunch. So welcome to the third panel, Women, Immigration, and the Law. This panel, we hope to discuss the struggles that immigrant women face in their interactions with the law. We have three fantastic panelists here. I'll start out with Kathy Fennelly, who is a senior fellow at the Immigration Policy Center. She's a political scientist, a former professor at the University of Minnesota. Her research focuses her research and outreach interests include the human rights of immigrants and refugees in the United States and preparedness of communities and public institutions to adapt to demographic changes. She has been Dean of the University of Minnesota Extension Service, a faculty member and department head at Pennsylvania State University, and a faculty member at Columbia University School of Public Health. She currently resides in New York and teaches master's courses in immigration health issues and intercultural competence, and is also, as I said, a senior fellow with the Immigration Policy Center. We also have Judy Rabinovitz, who is the Deputy Director of the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project, the national project, and also Director of Detention and Federal Enforcement Programs there. She's worked there since 1988, litigating class actions and impact cases on a variety of issues. In recent years, her work has focused a lot on detention, challenging detention policies. She played a leading role in, and I always have a hard time pronouncing this. Zadvidas v. Davis. And subsequent litigation, including the recent case in the Ninth Circuit, Rodriguez versus Robbins, where she was victorious in establishing that, at least in the Ninth Circuit, immigrant detainees have the right to a bond hearing after having been detained for more than 6 months. She's twice received the Jack Wasserman Memorial Award for Excellence in Litigation from the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and in 2006 she received the Carole King Award from the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild. She also serves as an adjunct professor at the New York University School of Law, and she's a member of the board of directors of the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild. Finally, we have Pooja Gehi, who is Director of Litigation and Advocacy at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project in New York, where she represents low-income, transgender, and intersex people of color in the areas of discrimination, immigration, access to government benefits, proper identification, and health care. Prior to working there, she wrote criminal appeals in the Fourth Circuit and was a member of the Justice and Solidarity Collective in Washington, D.C. She's organized against police brutality, the prison industrial complex, immigration detention, globalization, and unfair labor practices with the Coalition of Immokalee Farm Workers. So what I want to do is cede the floor to the panelists so they can kind of discuss each how they came to where they are and how they came to the work that they're doing. We'll start with you, Kathy.
Okay, well, nice to be here. Thank you very much, David. I moved back to New York a year ago from the University of Minnesota, where I was at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And when I first went there in 1996, I went as an administrator, and I spent a lot of time traveling around that state, all 87 counties. And up to that time, I had been doing demographic research on reproductive rights and early childbearing, comparing Latinos in the U.S. and Latin America. But as I traveled around Minnesota, I began to notice something, particularly in rural communities, and that is small towns that had been 15 years before less than 1% people of color were suddenly 20, 30, 40% people of color. Quite a remarkable change. And it was due in the rural areas to food processing and to poultry plants that opened up and hired immigrants and refugees. And I became fascinated with that. So I went back to the faculty 4 years after arriving at the school, and I thought I'm going to focus on migration policy and on changes, demographic changes and their implications for communities. So I've been doing that ever since.
Well, I've been at the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project for 25 years, so I've been doing this for a long time. When I try to think of sort of what got me into it, I can think about, obviously, my grandparents were immigrants and their experiences affected me. And then I think I just always, and partly part of the politics of growing up in the 60s, just a general sort of revulsion at inequality and how what the United States was doing to other countries. And to me, immigration is a real link between those two things, because people leave their countries because they can't survive in their countries. I mean, and there's reasons why that happens. And so immigration's a way of dealing, I mean, I was very much drawn to international human rights and what was happening in these countries, but immigration was a way to deal with it concretely in the United States, because those are the same people who are coming to the United States. And so initially I was involved in the Central America Solidarity movement about the wars in El Salvador and Guatemala and the war against Nicaragua. And then I got involved in refugees who sort of, reflected what was going on and defending refugees. And I think a lot of people get into immigrants' rights initially through asylum. It's sort of this compelling thing that pulls you in. Here are these people who are forced to come to this country because they're fleeing persecution, sometimes persecution that our own country has sort of helped in some way to provoke, or has whatever. And so it's an entry point, but then it's just the entry point. And then my interest in immigration got much far beyond that, in terms of, lots of people come to the United States not because they're fleeing political persecution, but just because they can't support themselves. And that's also the inequality. And then I started to get into immigration detention. And then immigration detention, a lot of the people who are locked up are people who've actually lived here legally for years, lawful permanent residents, who are being deported because they've committed crimes. And so my work right now, I'd say for the last 10 or 15 years, has mostly focused on that population of individuals who are longtime lawful permanent residents who were convicted of crimes, served their sentences, and now, because of the really harsh laws, face mandatory detention and mandatory deportation.
Hi, I'm Pooja. I'm the Director of Immigrant Justice at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. It's a little old of bio. And I'm just going to say a little bit about the project because I feel like I want to explain it. So we are a collectively run organization. We're based in New York City, and we represent transgender, gender nonconforming, and intersex people who are also either people of color or low income, most of whom are all of those things, right? And so we see the law, like we provide direct legal services, we do impact litigation, we do policy, and we do public education. And we see the law as really a tool that people need to access to survive, but not what we think is going to create meaningful, sustainable social change in the world. And so we also have what we call a movement building team, and they do campaign building, organizing, leadership development, and just like breaking isolation, because so many of the folks that we work with are just generally so isolated. So we try ideally for the legal services or all of the legal work. I'm a lawyer, I do that, the more boring side, but important, to intersect with the organizing work that's happening on the ground and that we're seeing our clients being most impacted by. So I would just say it is related to why I'm excited about the work, but our clients and members, are transgender, are gender nonconforming, are intersex, are immigrants. All of my clients are immigrants, are people living in poverty, are people with HIV and AIDS, are in and out of prisons and jails and detention centers, are survivors of violence, often state violence, and have many, many, many intersectional identities, right? And so I think when I was in law school, I was just telling Judy that September 11th happened my first week of law school, and I was like, oh my God, racial profiling, I really want to do work at the intersection of criminal immigration law. And so that's what I studied, and then I had really a lot of admiration for the project from kind of afar, mostly because of the analysis around gender justice being like inextricably linked to racial justice, immigrant justice, prison justice, classism, disability justice, all of those things, and how they're linked together. So then I applied.
Well, thank you all for that. I want to start with kind of a broad question, and I'll direct it to you, Kathy. want to start with asking you what are the key issues that need to be addressed, and how is immigration a women's issue?
Well, that is a very broad question, and as I looked at it, I thought I was going to focus on one aspect of it. And by way of introduction, I'll say that we were chatting a minute ago, and I was commenting on the gender ratio in the room, and then we started talking about public interest law, and David was saying that there are many, many, many more women in public interest law than in other programs, or than men in public interest law, I should say. And he said maybe that's the question is differences in what economic success means. Well, the reason I begin with that is that, to me, one of the really key questions about women in immigration is exactly that. What does economic success mean? What does economic productivity mean? And it's a question that Congress is not really asking, it's as much as answering. In the bills that have been, whether you look at the Senate bill that passed in 2007, whether you look at the Senate bill 744 that passed more recently, there are pieces of that legislation and in the companion legislation in the House that hasn't gone to the floor yet that answer that question very specifically, saying economic productivity means high skills, high levels of education, high wages, that we want economically productive immigrants. And that's well and good. I think it's difficult to argue and to say we don't want people who are economically successful, unless we think about the gender differences here and what are the implications for women as immigrants. And they're profound, because although women, like men who are foreign-born, are a very diverse group, and we have many women who are entrepreneurs, we have many women who are in the high-skilled visa categories and who have high levels of education. Compared to men, women tend to have overall lower levels of completed schooling, lower levels of English proficiency, lower levels of high-skilled positions or previous employment. And so if we move to what's termed often a merit-based system, and if we privilege people who have those particular measures of economic productivity, then what we're doing is we're discriminating against women who are coming, perhaps they're much more likely to come through family-based immigration. They're much more likely to be working in the underground economy, to be working part-time, to be working at lower wages, and to be working in those professions which are vitally important to the United States as a whole as we age and as we need caregivers and domestic workers and people who are in the health professions but may not be able to get jobs that are equal to their skills because they've come from another country. So there are very profound implications for this. The other thing that has been written into the Senate bill is a change in family-based immigration categories, the categories that are privileged for who's allowed to enter the country. And the merit-based point system that I mentioned in many ways absorbs visa preferences for siblings and for adult married children of U.S. citizens. And so rather than having the preference categories that they currently enjoy, the changes would fold those into a point system where, yes, you get a few points for these kinds of family preferences, but they're far outweighed by these other measures of economic productivity. So I guess I'd just like to leave it at that and to say that the intersection here, even though that's a very specific issue and question, in fact, the intersection with the kinds of things that are being discussed at this conference is quite broad, because we're talking about issues of wages for women, we're talking about issues of fairness, we're talking about reproductive rights as women take on these roles in the household as opposed to perhaps paid work or higher paid work, and who assume responsibilities for childcare and for holding families together. Thanks.
So I'm going to start by saying that when I heard that I was invited for this panel, I told David he had the wrong person. I said, because I don't really work on issues of immigrant women. I work on issues of immigrants' rights, and he said, no, that's fine. And I, because half of the people who are immigrants are women, and the stuff that we do affects both women and men. But I didn't feel like I could sort of say that I'm working particularly on behalf of immigrant women, except that our issues affect both. I do feel like after having, listened to the keynote speaker, I mean, everything that she said, applies to immigrant women, so that immigrant women have this situation of being what's being immigrants, and especially then if they're undocumented immigrants, they have those disadvantages, but then they also have those same things that apply to women in general. So they have that. But our work, and just following up a little bit from what Kathy was saying, to me, the lack of visas for unskilled workers affects all undocumented workers. It's not just women. I mean, obviously women are maybe a little more affected by it, but most of the undocumented workers are unskilled workers, and the fact that our immigration system only gives 5,000 visas, that's why people are undocumented, and that's why often when you ask, why are there people are illegal because the law makes them illegal. Otherwise they wouldn't be illegal. Everyone wants to be legal. It's just if there's no way to come here legally, because all the visas are for people with skilled work, even though we know that we need all these people to do unskilled work, then people are going to be illegal or undocumented. And the same thing with the family preferences, which affects men and women together, and maybe more women in the sense that men immigrate first and then obtain status, and then they want to bring their wives and kids. But those backlogs, that's what make people undocumented, because you're facing a choice between being separated from your spouse or your kids for 10 or 15 or 20 years while the visa process goes, or coming illegally and living together. And I remember reading recently some judge's decision where he was criticizing this woman for having helped smuggle her child, arrange for it to be smuggled to the United States, and saying, what kind of mother would do that? And what kind of mother would leave her children to begin with? What was this like, what kind of world does this judge live in? People do this all the time, and they do it because, they're forced to, not because they want to, but because they're forced to, because, they either are going to support their kids or they're not going to support their kids. And then they're either going to be separated from their kids or they're going to be with their kids. So anyway, that's a long answer to that. I want to just say a little bit, though, about what I do and what the Immigrants' Rights Project does. And the way the ACLU is structured, we have a bunch of different projects. So we have a Women's Rights Project, which does do some stuff that is specifically around immigrant women and immigrant women workers. And then we have a Reproductive Rights Project, which does stuff particularly about that, and some of that might intersect with immigrant women. And then the Immigrants' Rights Project, we might collaborate with those projects when they're doing things around immigrant women, but the particular issues that we work on, the particular issues that I work on, that I've been working on, have to do with deportation and detention. And then over the last, 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years, the project has expanded to do a lot more in terms of fighting state and local anti-immigrant laws. So like the kind of laws that Arizona did, the Show Me Your Papers law, and then you started to sort of see in Georgia and Alabama and Utah and everywhere else. So we've been very involved in fighting those kinds of laws. Alabama, which was going to prevent children from going to school unless they identified their undocumented parents. All these things affect women and men. And driver's license laws, if you can't get a driver's license, that affects women and men. We've been fighting those, and part and parcel in that is the local enforcement of immigration law, local police enforcement of immigration law, which I think Pooja is going to talk more about, but is really, really a very big thing that we're dealing with right now, because it makes immigrants and communities in general much more vulnerable to crime, because they're not ready to contact local police, because then they're going to be turned over. And this is true with domestic violence victims, who are examples of them calling the police, and then the victim is put into detention and, put into deportation proceedings. But I'm going to leave it at that for now, and I'm glad to talk about this stuff later and answer questions.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess I always like to just start by saying that the history of immigration is constructed by Congress, right? Congress has plenary power to decide who is desirable to enter into the United States and who is undesirable. And we've seen this through legislation that excludes people on the basis of race, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, communicable diseases, physical and psychiatric disabilities. And I just like to name that because I think, a lot of these things have been found to be unconstitutional, but I think it's really important just to remember that Congress has power and still in deciding who can enter and who cannot enter. And I think what Judy was saying is about criminalization is one of the ways in which criminalization, and also the ways in which people access visas are also the ways in which Congress decides who's desirable and undesirable, right? So I work with low-income trans people who are immigrants and all of those other things I named earlier. And because they're living in poverty, because they're transgender, because they're people of color, because they're perceived immigrants, they're really, really disproportionately targeted by the police and more likely to interact with local, federal, ICE, all of those levels of law enforcement generally. And they're also really a lot less likely to get family-based visas because I have so many of my clients, I would say, either don't have any family who could sponsor them, or their family sponsored them, and then they came out as transgender, and then their family pulled their visa. I see that happening over and over and over. And for similar reasons, my clients are very unlikely to be able to get employment-based sponsorship. So I just want to name that I think all of the legislation that's designed to distinguish between criminal aliens or good versus bad immigrants. More recently, we see legislation fighting against the war on terror. All of these pieces of legislation really disproportionately affect the people that I work with because of the ways that their identities are policed. And so I'm just going to name a few really big things. One, in 1996, this law, the IRA, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, and I know you worked on this a lot, passed. It did a lot of really bad things. One of the bad things was making two crimes involving moral turpitude a grounds for deportation or removal now. And so Congress never defined crimes involving moral turpitude. It's been all interpreted through case law, but I think really not coincidentally, crimes involving moral turpitude are also the crimes or the acts that the clients that I work with do to survive, right? So in New York, we see a lot of people turnstile jump, sneaking into the subway, and it's charged as a theft of services, which is a crime involving moral turpitude. And people turnstile jump to get to their job, get to their work center, get to their immigration appointment, get to their court hearing, get their child to school. All of those things. Similarly, prostitution, of course, is a crime involving moral turpitude. It has its own separate exception, and I would say that my clients sometimes can't get jobs in the books because they don't have identification that matches their gender identity, or they don't want to out themselves by applying for a job, and they do engage in sex work, right? Or they do trade sex for money, and they're disproportionately policed because of their identity. And also, a lot of my clients don't engage in sex work and are still profiled by the police for doing sex work. So my clients are just disproportionately targeted and criminalized by the police. And then I was just going to say that, it's really common for people I work with to call me and be like, I just got picked up, I don't know for what. I think it was, walking while trans, or walking while trans and black, or walking while trans, black, and an immigrant. People are really savvy to that, and it's happening on the daily, and I could talk a lot about stop and frisk later, maybe. And then I would just really quickly say that since September 11th, all of these laws that deputize local law enforcement to enforce immigration law have been passing on both state and federal levels. And because of all the reasons I just said, policing is really has dire consequences for the people I work with. Relying on the policing system, which is inherently homophobic, racist, transphobic, classist, all of these different things, to enforce immigration, which is also all of those things, is really problematic. And so I'm just going to name a few. One is 287G is a law, a federal law that jurisdictions can opt in or out of. It allows ICE officers, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to have an office inside prisons and jails. New York is not in a 287G jurisdiction. I don't know if Philadelphia is. Do you know?
I don't know.
If anyone knows, they should tell me. There's also the Arizona SB 1070 laws and the copycat laws. I like the term "show me your papers" laws because obviously they're based clearly on profiling, right, on your perceived immigrant status. There's also the criminal alien program, which is in New York City, allows ICE officials to be inside prisons and jails and literally all the time ask my clients, "Are you undocumented? I'm a social worker," like totally lie about their identities, or like, I can help you get status. Have you ever done prostitution? And then they have an immigration detainer dropped on them. And then secure communities, which we can talk about more later, is my own nemesis, specific nemesis that mandates that local law enforcement when they make an arrest, send immigrants to ICE to see if it's a match. And then I'm just gonna end there 'cause it's a lot.
Well, something that was mentioned at least briefly in each of the things that you said, that each of you said, was detention. And I wanted to bring this back quickly to Judy and ask about the case that you worked on, Rabinovitz v. Davis, and kind of how your work has turned since that case. And
Yeah, I will try to keep this brief because this is what I've been doing for the last 20 years. But I did react, when you said, David, before, oh, we just won this case where people get bond hearings after 6 months, I was thinking, like, what's most people's reaction? Like, bond hearing after 6 months? Why should you have to wait why is that a victory that you get a bond hearing after 6 months? And it isn't a victory, except that we lost a case in 2003, a case that I argued before the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court upheld 5-4 a 1996 law that provided for mandatory immigration detention of immigrants who were facing deportation based on conviction for a wide range of crimes, including two crimes of moral turpitude. So, we had, even post 9/11, we had won in the 3 circuits that I argued it. All of those 3 circuits struck it down as unconstitutional, which is pretty unusual for an immigration statute because, as Pooja was saying, Congress has plenary power in the area of immigration, and so the courts are very, reluctant to strike something down as unconstitutional. Well, that's what happened when we went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, even though everywhere else it was like, all you're asking for is a bond hearing. How do you lock someone up without a bond hearing? We're not saying you can't lock them up. We're just saying give them a bond hearing. And the Supreme Court said, no, this is immigration. You can lock them up without a bond hearing. But fortunately, it said, it also, distorted the facts, and it said usually this is very short. For 85% of the people, it's only 45 days. For the others, it's 15%, it's like 4 or 5 months. And so basically, as soon as that decision came out in 2003, our work since then, 10 years, has been to limit it, has been to say, okay, Supreme Court upheld mandatory detention, but it held it for people who had conceded they were deportable and for a brief and limited period of time. And so that's what my litigation has involved, getting the courts to recognize what should be obvious, which is that the government cannot mandatorily detain someone pending removal proceedings indefinitely, as long as those proceedings last. And we've represented people who've been locked up for 3 years, 4 years, all 18 months, and whatever, that have been just locked up without a bond hearing, and then we get an order from the court that they get a bond hearing, and they get released. Even in some cases, once the court orders that they get a bond hearing, ICE just releases them on a bond. They don't even bother with a bond hearing because this law is one that actually prevents ICE from exercising discretion as well. It just says they have to be locked up. You cannot decide that this person's not a danger or flight risk. So that's what my work involved. Just to link it back to the Rabinovitz decision, the Rabinovitz decision, which came 2 years before the law upholding mandatory detention. Rabinovitz was pre-9/11, and that was a decision that involved locking people up indefinitely after they had already been ordered deported. And in that context, the Supreme Court did reject the government's argument about the plenary power doctrine and said, someone who's been ordered deported, you know, you can't just lock them up indefinitely if their country won't take them back. And that 6 months is a reasonable period of time to effectuate their removal. And otherwise, if they can't be removed, you've got to release them. So that's where there's this tension. There's this sort of 6-month limit if you've already been ordered removed. But if you're still fighting your case, the government says they can lock you up forever without a bond hearing. And so that's what we've been fighting on.
Thank you.
And just so you know, these detention laws do affect women. They do affect women, and just to bring it back to that, and we've represented women who've, you know, and have talked about what it's like to be in detention. These are people who've never spent a day in jail, even if they were convicted of an offense. Maybe they pled guilty to some minor drug offense and got probation, and then suddenly, you know, 10 years later, immigration comes to their house and they're locked up, taken away from their kids, and in immigration jail for, you know, for 7 months.
Thank you. That actually is a great segue into a question that I wanted to shift over to you, Pooja, and that is, you know, up until this point we've been talking a lot, except for just right now, we've been talking a lot about these detention policies in terms of how they affect someone, or the likelihood of someone getting detained, the likelihood of someone getting, you know, basic procedural rights after that. But in terms of detention itself, I wanted to ask, in your experience with your clients, how do they experience detention, and what are the, you know, unique effects of detention that kind of fall upon their shoulders?
Yeah. I mean, my clients are, for the most part, transgender women who are immigrants. And detention centers are very much, I think, the same as prisons and jails in this country. And I mean, in fact, they're actually private prisons, right, for the most part. And so trans women are housed according to their assigned sex at birth. So they're almost always housed with men, and for all the reasons that people can think of, that makes people really vulnerable to rape, violence, assault, death. I mean, a lot of it is by immigration officers, a lot of the violence that people experience. And I think that just like, you know, we have a prison justice project and an immigrant justice project, and I think we see the exact same things playing out. People aren't able to access their health care. People experience really intense violence. People are indefinitely detained. Like, we argue more and more that people don't, because people are trans, they should not be in detention and instead get the ankle bracelet thing, which is not so awesome, but better than being locked up, right? And that argument has actually been successful because of the violence that trans people experience inside. And then I would just add that there's also been stories of really amazing resilience and solidarity around trans immigrant detainees. And one case is the Victoria Arenas case. Are people familiar with that? She was a trans woman locked up in Florida, and she was trans and experiencing violence, but not by the other detainees, more so by the institution itself, right? And then she was HIV positive. She wasn't being given her meds, and actually they were just giving her Tylenol. And all of these people did all of these other detainees did all of this support and organizing to try to get her taken to the hospital, and were really supportive just around her health and well-being. And she ended up dying, but it was like a really big, outrageous story, and I think it was really amazing to watch just the solidarity inside.
Thank you. Kathy, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to comment that there also, in addition to private prisons, there are thousands of immigrants who are in detention in county jails that have contracts with ICE, and oftentimes those facilities are set up only for very short-term detention and don't have exercise areas, don't have any of the provisions. The medical staff have no idea what's the difference between an immigrant and a refugee, or the likelihood of torture, for example, on the part of refugees who may be detained in these short-term facilities. The staff almost never have any training in immigration, and that's something that I've been working on for the past few years with some colleagues in Minnesota, developing some training programs for online training that is part of continuing education that can be offered to staff in some of these detention centers.
The only thing I'd like to add in terms of detention and linking it to women is just separation from children. I mean, first of all, detention affects women, whether it's the woman who's detained or it's their partner who's detained. I mean, if it's a male partner who's detained and they're left having to be the primary breadwinner, take care of the kids, travel 3 or 4 hours to visit their, to visit their partner if they, can. And so it's a huge burden on women whether they're detained or not. But when they're detained and separated from their kids, one of the things that I find most, I guess, painful and offensive about the immigration detention conditions is the visiting policies, which are incredibly restrictive. I mean, I don't know that they're more restrictive than prison, but this is supposed to be civil detention. And, when ICE did its own review of its detention policies and said, we need to revamp this, this is not supposed to be punitive, this is civil, it seems like one way that it's so clear that this is not civil is when you have these visitation policies where you can only visit your kids through a glass window, or as one of my clients described, she was able to visit her children finally after a certain number of months in person, but they weren't able to touch. They weren't able to touch, and her daughter went to hug her, and the guard said, "Get down," it's just she said, this is not hurting me, this is hurting my kids. And she was ready to leave. She just couldn't take being in jail anymore, but she also felt like what it would mean she'd be separated from her daughter, or her daughter would have to go back to Guatemala, and that wouldn't be good for her. All her kids are U.S. citizens. But, it just tore her heart out to see how her children were being affected by this. And interestingly, one of her daughter's response, she finally won her case, was reunited with her family, although she says she still has the after effects, lives with these effects of having been locked up suddenly out of the blue. But one of her children, decided to do a project about immigration detention, and as her high school project, and I don't know what happened with it, but
And then there's some facilities where you can only have video exchanges.
visitation.
You can't, right?
Yeah.
Can I just add one more thing? I mean, I think in addition, there's just all this contradiction around laws that are intended to like help immigrant women, like a U visa, which is a visa for people who are survivors of a violent crime, and a T visa, which is something that I do a lot of work around, is a visa for a person who is trafficked into some kind of business. Most of my clients are trafficked into sex work. But then because there's so little access, so there's like these laws that exist, and I think there's some good intentions around them, and they're useful sometimes, but then because there's so little access to people who are inside, there's never screening. Like, people don't get screened for, are you a trafficker? Were you a survivor of a violent crime? Are you an asylee? Or potentially, are you an asylee or a refugee? And I think it's just such a basic contradiction, because so many of the folks I work with, end up in detention because they are trafficked or because they are survivors of domestic violence, and then don't access the visa.
Thank you. So far we've kind of discussed a broad array of laws and federal programs, state programs that affect immigrants and immigrant women. And I wanted to and we've discussed this a little bit, but I wanted to broaden the discussion of this kind of aspect of that, which is how you each take women and gender issues into account in your work. And I'd like to start with you, Kathy.
Well, I've moved here this year from Minnesota, and I'm not working specifically on women and gender issues right now. I'm working with the New York Immigration Coalition, preparing for legalization for everybody. So I think I'll defer to my colleagues on the panel on that.
Well, as I already said, we don't distinguish between women and men. But that being said, I mean, the Immigrants' Rights Project and the ACLU in general, we always have like a multi-pronged strategy. So a lot of my work focuses on litigation, but litigation is always seen as part of a larger advocacy strategy, both administrative advocacy and legislative advocacy, and that includes also communications work. And I do think that focusing on how some of the laws that we're challenging, like the state laws, how they affect women, is helpful from a public relations point of view. It's helpful from an administrative advocacy point of view. Those laws don't just target women, but but I think that sometimes you can present the issue in a more sympathetic way when you show that if you have women as plaintiffs in these cases and can show how this woman who's a mother who's just trying to drive her kid to school got stopped. Not that it couldn't have been a father who got, but I'm just saying that I do think that that there are issues where, in some ways, and I think this is less true with litigation than with the administrative advocacy and the legislative advocacy and the communications, but since they're all part of a whole. But there's some areas where women offer an opening, and I think that the whole VAWA legislation, the Violence Against Women Act, is a great example of it. I mean, that was a situation where you weren't going to get anything good on immigration out of the Congress. And in that context, women's rights advocates did an amazing job getting this VAWA legislation and getting it to benefit women so that women could self-petition. Women who were victims of abusive relationships could self-petition for immigration status. That's huge. That was absolutely huge. And there were things in that VAWA legislation that benefited other people, not just women. So I do think it's something that we keep in mind that, it's that there are ways that when you take the most vulnerable people and take a population that's sympathetic, whether it's women, whether it's children or mentally disabled, that maybe you can get something through Congress, or maybe you can get something through the administration. I mean, the administration has a lot more authority than it often says it does, which is what we now see in terms of the Dreamers having pushed to at least get what's called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, even though Congress wouldn't pass the DREAM Act. Finally, President Obama was forced to do DACA. So, and I think, a lot of the Dreamers were women, a lot of them were men, whatever. But I think that I think that you want to use examples of vulnerable and sympathetic people. Look, if you're dealing with the population that I deal with a lot are people who are convicted of crimes. Yeah. I am ready to defend them to the hilt. I feel like, these people came here, they're lawful permanent residents, they committed a crime, they served their time, they should not be subject to mandatory deportation. There should be something that looks at the effect on their kids, that looks at their rehabilitation, that looks at this. The law doesn't allow for any of that. But it doesn't mean that they're the best people to be using as poster child, even I think that the law is, bad. And I don't really know how this relates, but I was just reading a decision the other day about this woman who's undocumented, and she and her whole family has lived here for years, and they should be eligible for what's a form of relief called cancellation of removal. But the legislature Congress set the standard as you have to show extreme and unusual hardship to your U.S. citizen children if you're deported. And the fact that the child had lived in the United States the whole time and was going to be deported to Guatemala, was going to have to leave, didn't speak Spanish, all of that, the court said this is not extreme and unusual hardship. And they said, we don't think that this is a fair result. We think that you seem like a great family, you're contributing to the community, you're, all these great things about you, but this is what the law says, our hands are tied. And, ultimately, we want the laws to change, but even before the laws change, there are things that the administration can do in terms of deciding, why waste time prosecuting these cases? These are not cases. These people pose no danger to anyone. They're contributing to the community. Why are we wasting, public tax dollars to put these people in removal proceedings, to go through all the way up to federal court to fight this case? Why? And that's where I feel like, all of us, to the extent that we can be, I think right now, I'm pretty pessimistic about there being comprehensive immigration reform, but I think that there is an opening for, as my personal view, I think there is an opening to push the administration to say, you're responsible for deporting all these people. You're deporting more people than have ever been deported before, and you don't have to. You don't have to, and you shouldn't be, and to call them to task in these cases.
I was just going to talk about secure communities in New York as as an example or story about the way that gender and advocacy have played out. And it's so before secure communities was a federal mandate. There was space. I worked a lot on trying to keep it out of New York, and and other states did too. And in doing that, we compiled stories of people who were going to end up being criminalized or end up being deported, or all of these things because they're going to be forced to interact with immigration and customs enforcement, and then they're going to be found out to be undocumented. And we ended up being successful in pushing our Governor Cuomo, to say no to secure communities for a minute, and then until our president made it a federal mandate. But the narrative that always stands out is the narrative of the undocumented immigrant woman who's a survivor of domestic violence, who doesn't want to call the police because she's afraid that she's going to get deported. And I think that is really useful, and that was really successful in getting the governor to say, I don't want secure communities in my city. But then it became a federal mandate, and we moved to working with, I'm part of this anti-violence coalition. That's what we do, is work on stopping the implementation of secure communities. And most of the people in the group are domestic violence, pretty mainstream domestic violence advocates. So we moved from working on the government level to the city level with city council, and did similar, hey, city council, you can make bills that limit when the NYPD will drop an immigration detainer, or when the Department of Corrections, our local jail system, will drop an immigration detainer. And we were successful to some extent. The speaker of the city council did pass bills that did both of those things, that limited the effects of when the NYPD and the Department of Corrections could drop immigrant detainers. But they were all based on criminalization. So if a person has no prior criminal convictions with a few carve-outs, then the NYPD will not send the person's fingerprints to ICE to see if they're a match. And that's great. I mean, I think that it's helpful in some ways. But again, the narrative of the undocumented survivor who's afraid to call the police is the one that really stood out. And in challenging our city council, I did a lot of challenging our city council and saying, listen, that's great. And also, my clients are criminalized for who they are. They're criminalized for walking down the street. They're, basing it on local law enforcement is not the way to go. And our city council speaker got mad, was like, well, if you don't like the bill, I don't care, I'm pulling it. So I think so I was like, I love the bill, pass the bills, they're great, whatever. But I think that I think there's a nuanced way to do it, to say this is a sympathetic story, and also not sacrifice other people's stories that are real, and I think not perpetuate the good immigrant, bad immigrant stereotype is really important.
Pooja, I wanted to ask you a question about something that that you wrote about in a paper for the Harvard Journal of Law and Gender. It was a small footnote that I noticed, but it really struck me, and it was that there's sorry, it also started the editors of that journal, but they did a good job. I saw it. So they noticed, you noted a case, and I believe it's a state appellate case in New York where the court determined that, and this is relevant to the kind of interplay between secure communities and state law enforcement, that someone who visibly presents as a male carrying a purse, that was a factor playing towards reasonable suspicion.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you kind of how you see that playing out with your clients.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I see that all the time, right? Because for the Fourth Amendment, you need a reasonable, articulable suspicion that crime is afoot. You all have taken Crim Pro, right? And that we know that that gives so much deference to the police. And so that case, which I cannot remember the name of, but it is a trans woman and she's carrying a purse, and the cops stop her and they say she's suspicious because she's a man carrying a purse. So obviously she is dealing drugs, whatever, doing prostitution, I don't know. But yeah, I see that play out all the time. I mean, I think that just like being a transgender person is grounds for suspicion, or grounds for like automatically thinking someone's engaging in sex work.
Which is interesting that was explicitly codified in that case.
Yeah. It's really rare that it's like in writing, so I like that case a lot.
Kathy, I wanted to really quickly run back to you, and I know that you talked briefly about the kind of Immigration Policy Center's opposition to the point system, and I know that that I believe that the Immigration Policy Center also presented to Congress or to a subcommittee about kind of the problems that caused, particularly for women. I wanted to know what kind of reactions on the Hill have been to that discussion of how these policies affect women.
Well, speaking broadly about what the Immigration Policy Center is doing and the reactions to a number of immigration reform questions, as you all know, Congress is quite polarized right now, and so there's a lot of work with individual staffers for both Republican and Democratic congresspeople. I think the staffers often realize that one of the things we need to build into any law that passes are exceptions and waivers, and that will be especially important for women because of some of the points that I was making before about the economic point system, the merit-based point system, and the way that discriminates against women. There is a Congressional Women's Working Group that is looking at immigration issues. I think there's only one Republican woman on it, Ileana Ross-Lehtinen, who's a Cuban-American representative from Florida. But there's some supporters of immigration reform in ways that would benefit women who may not be speaking up right now, and I believe will speak up after the midterm elections.
There's always that factor. Thank you. I guess I want to transition to a discussion about each of your perspectives, because Pooja, I know you work kind of in all three of these arenas of policy, and you mentioned you work in policy, direct services, and impact litigation. And Judy, your focus is impact litigation, and Kathy, you are working on policy. And I wanted to ask, and I want to kind of bring up something topical in my question. So it relates to scholarship of a local professor. Her name is Lenore Carpenter at Temple University, Beasley School of Law, and our Journal of Law and Social Change is actually in the process of publishing an article by Professor Carpenter entitled "Getting Queer Priorities Straight: How Direct Legal Services Can Democratize Issue Prioritization in the LGBT Rights Movement." And in her article, she discusses challenges that advocates in social movements face in bridging the gaps between direct services strategies, legislative strategies, and impact litigation strategies, and in dealing with sometimes conflicting interests. And these concerns are going to exist in any movement for social change. And what I wanted to ask was how can each of these three arenas mentioned by Professor Carpenter, and all represented on the panel here, how can they work together to improve synthesis in addressing women's issues in the immigrant rights movement? And I'll start with you, Pooja. Sorry, it's a loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I think about all the time, is what is the best strategy? How do we know what's the most important thing to work on? And I think as a direct service provider, well, I do all of those things. Like, I always take direction from our clients, from what we're seeing as the most urgent needs on the ground. And I actually, at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, when I started, I designed the Immigrant Justice Program sort of because I saw it as such an urgent need, because so many people were coming in. Because I had a background in immigration, and we did immigration a little bit, but we didn't we did mostly referrals to asylum lawyers, things like that, and I really developed it because people were in crisis. Like, people were coming in being like, I'm facing removal, I don't know what to do, and I think the way that those crises inform impact litigation in really important ways, right? Because those are the things that need to be moved. Like, those are the things that are impacting people on the deepest level. And I think simultaneously, I think the policy question is similar. Like, what is happening on the ground to people that really needs to shift? And I think by including, like, we include clients and community members in policy negotiations a lot, and I think that's a really powerful way to actually allow people to tell their stories and move legislation that needs to happen.
Thank you. Judy?
Well, we do, I mean, as I said, our litigation is very much part of a larger strategy. So when we litigate, it's not with the idea that we're just going to win this issue in the Supreme Court, but more that we're going to win it and be able to apply pressure so that the administration will change its policy or Congress will change its policy or something. So the litigation and the advocacy are very much linked. We don't do direct services, but we rely on organizations that do direct services. So we rely on them to be telling us what are the issues that they're seeing, and also when there are things that we want to challenge, we rely on them for providing us with good plaintiffs so that we can challenge them. So I mean, I personally can often feel frustrated that I don't do direct services, just because I feel like, you're more removed when you're doing the policy and the impact litigation. Even though we have clients in the impact litigation, we usually try to find people who have their own attorneys who are representing them in their cases so that we can make sure that their interests are being looked out for. So I don't have as much of a relationship. I mean, recently I did take on a case where I was representing some individuals, and it was it also coincided with being able to bring a challenge to prolonged detention, because these individuals have been locked up for a few years, and there was something that was personally satisfying about meeting them and feeling like I was fighting for them. There's also something that was so
Exhausting.
Awful, when we lost, and so awful, also I sort of said, think about what you wish for, because, having individual clients, the work never ends. I mean, you always feel like there's one more person you can call, one more paper you can file, not that that's not true when you're doing impact litigation as well, but I don't think quite as much. I mean, I feel like, when I think of that direct service providers are representing lots of people, I mean, I can't imagine how they do it. I mean, I really can't imagine how they do it, because I feel like just representing, a few people, I just feel like I should be calling so-and-so, I should be calling so-and-so, I should be filing this, I should be filing that, I should be doing this all over the place, I should be getting press on this, I should be, so anyway, I don't know if that answers your question. I think that we depend on the direct service providers. We also want those examples when we do advocacy. We need examples so that we can present them to Congress or the administration or the press. So I think that these things work together, but we just don't have the resources. I mean, we don't have the resources. I get calls. It's interesting. I've been working at this job for 25 years. You move up the chain. I'm deputy director and director of this and that. And what I find most compelling is the intake that we get. I mean, that's not what I'm supposed to be spending my time on. They're not paying me the big bucks, quote unquote, for reading intake letters from detainees. But that's what gets me going, and I need that, because I've been doing this for years, and I still feel outraged by it, and that's why I want to fight. And it's hard though to not then take these cases, and so then you want there to be a network of people who you can refer them to, so you're not just giving them like, oh, these are this list of people, and know that the list of people is going to say, oh, here's another list of people. You want there to be some meaningful way to get them help. And that's where there has to be development of legal services and support for legal services. And, that's just essential.
Well, from a policy perspective, I guess maybe unlike Judy, I'm actually quite confident that comprehensive immigration reform is going to pass. Maybe not the ideal bill that we would all like to see, but I could go into that later
That's
on
good.
if you want to hear more about that, why I feel that way. But one thing that is clear is that we have, I think, fewer silos in some of the advocates for women's issues than we used to, meaning that we see now, it used to be, I think, that women working in reproductive rights were not working so much on immigration issues, with a couple of exceptions. Women working on issues of wages and poverty and so on. I think we see more cross-sectional collaboration now on these issues, which is very encouraging. Some of the feminist groups, like Ms. just came out with the Ms. Foundation and Ms. Magazine with a statement on immigration. Gloria Steinem has been making speeches about immigration and the need for reform and so forth. So I think that's very promising. As far as a message for individuals who are thinking about kind of what next, or if you care about these issues, what to do, two things come to mind. One is, it may sound cliched, but talk to your representatives every single way that you can. Tell them this is an issue you care about and that you support some of the principles. I hope you support some of the principles that we're advocating for here today. And then in addition to that, if you are working in any way or know people who are undocumented, help them begin to get their papers ready. Because, as I say, I believe we are going to have reform, and if you're undocumented in particular, you're going to need a lot of paperwork that you can find on the Immigration Policy Center website, other websites, what kinds of documents, proof of employment, proof of residence, et cetera. It's going to take a while for people to pull those documents together, proof of tax records and so forth. So that would be individual advice.
Great, thank you. At this point, I wanted to open the floor to questions from the audience. We should have 3 people walking around with microphones. So yeah, if anyone has questions. All right, over here. Andy will make his way over here.
Judy, you may have answered this question already, but I can't get, I'm embarrassed to say that I can't get my 23-year-old son to vote because he says that they're all the same. And I say that that's maybe true at a very macro level, but underneath there are big differences between the last 2 people who ran for president, for example. But what I heard you saying is that the current president has not really walked the walk in terms of fixing some of these bureaucratic or regulatorily driven bad things. Is that true? Is there a difference between this president and the previous president?
Absolutely.
Absolutely?
Absolutely. I mean, that doesn't mean I'm going to defend what he's done on immigration, but.
No, I was talking specifically about immigration.
Specifically about immigration?
Yeah. I mean, what you said about, I can argue the other things, thank you,
Right.
but what you said
Immigration?
about, how do we make him move? How do we make him exercise, and maybe it's political that he doesn't want to, but.
I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, so, look, there's plenty of reasons to vote for this president over someone else that have nothing to do with immigration. As for immigration, I don't know. I mean, you'll hear different people say different things. I mean, I think that. I
I can
don't know,
jump in if you want.
You want to chime in? Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that there are different positions. There's some people that are really, really angry at him and feel like, this is the worst administration in terms of enforcing the law. On the other hand, he did do the DACA thing. There are good people in his administration, that are sensitive to things. I think there's a political reality that he's up against. And I think that there has to be pressure. There has to be pressure on him. I think that my understanding was that there was a political calculus that, if we want to get comprehensive immigration reform, we have to show we're tough on enforcement. So all we've gotten is tough on enforcement. But, I think he wants comprehensive immigration reform, but then again, I think that, I think George Bush probably wanted comprehensive immigration reform also. So I don't know that in terms of immigration, you see a huge difference between Republicans and Democrats in terms of the enforcement, thing. I don't know.
I think we do, in terms of enforcement. I mean, I guess what I would say is Obama's not running anymore, right? So if we're talking, and when we're talking about comprehensive immigration reform, we're talking about Congress, and I see huge differences between Republican positions on comprehensive immigration
The
reform and
positions in
Democrat.
Congress, yeah, there are positions in Congress, but when you look at administrations, I mean, we got,
Administrations is,
I mean,
right,
we got the worst immigration law in history under Clinton,
yeah.
the 1996 law. So, and, Bush was ready to do a legalization, and then there was 9/11. So, I mean, I think that there are some ways that, Republicans, it might be easier for a Republican president to pass, comprehensive reform. I mean, this is not at all, please don't quote me on this, because I don't have any interest in having a Republican president, even though the ACLU is completely nonpartisan, and so I'm speaking, from my own personal point of view. But I think that, definitely there's a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans right now in Congress on immigration reform. How much of it is just political, that they don't want to be able to give any points to Obama, and how much is, actually ideologically what they think, and I don't know. I mean, it's
But I
just
do
a
think
mess.
the votes matter hugely, because to me, it's the composition of Congress, the composition of the House. What happens in the Senate will make a huge difference on whether it's all enforcement. I mean, whether, some of these provisions to have impossible targets to meet for enforcement before we have any kind of meaningful reform are, at the moment, ideologically driven. So
So maybe it's more important Congress than the president,
I think so.
because I think that the president, he can't act,
Yeah.
can't accomplish comprehensive reform without Congress. He could do these other things. He could do these
some of the
other
other
things,
things.
and that's what I think we need to push him on.
Wonderful. Do we have any other questions? Back there?
You were talking a little bit earlier about secure communities in Philadelphia, and yesterday Mayor Nutter signed an executive order limiting the program in Philadelphia, due primarily to the work that was sort of acknowledged, mainly by Pooja earlier in your topic of community organizations pressuring the city council and protesting, and undocumented people coming out of the shadows and organizing in a really strategic way. And I was wondering, that leads into my question about the role of lawyers and also service providers in helping out those community organizing efforts, and what role that plays in passing good immigration law.
Yeah, that's really great. I would love to hear the details of the bill, actually, after this. And I think that I've also written a paper about the role of lawyers in social movements or something like that. But so I would say that, I think it's really important as a lawyer to take direction from community organizing and folks that are impacted on the ground. And I think that lawyers have a really strategic role that they can play, right? Like, I can break down the law. I can say, I understand the law. I can explain immigration to people, which is like some ridiculous system of nonsense, if you ask me. But I always want to take the lead from what people are experiencing in their lives. And I think the way the SRLP has both an organizing and legal service provision piece is really an exciting model, and we're always trying to grow it, trying to experiment with it. It's totally not perfect, and I really believe in it too.
We'll take one more question, and then we'll have to end so that we can make the next panel. Does anyone else have a question? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you to each of our panelists.
And thank you.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you, David.